so I have a question for you. What is your favorite city in the whole world?
Houston, Texas.
Oh, yes, you got it right, okay? It took a little bit for us to get there, but the Texas Revolution began on October 2nd, 1835, followed by an era of independence. It was led by Sam Houston, a controversial political figure who nonetheless served as the state's first and third president. He pushed the effort for Texas to join the United States, became one of our first senators, and was eventually removed from office for his beliefs about slavery and secession. Sam Houston died on this day in 1863. If you're doing the math, that was 160 years ago. Historian Raffi Andonian recently shared details on the Texas Revolution and one of the central figures, Sam Houston. Raffi, you are a natural-born historian, but you didn't know it as a kid. You were just curious by nature.
That's right. As a child, I read about history all over the country in the East Coast and even a little bit in the Southwest. And I ended up just learning and going down a path and working at historic sites. And here I am.
Yeah, you look at things differently. You know, I think a lot of us get so busy in our day-to-day life, we kind of pass by things and you might say, I wonder what that building really stands for or how it got started. But we don't go any further than that. You went further than that. What's the importance of that?
Well, what it does is it tells you who we are, why we believe what we believe, the mythology and the origin story that we create about ourselves and what that says about us. The past has never really passed. It shapes the present all around you. And also, I think it develops a certain kind of critical thinking skills and inquiry, like you said. If you just stop and ask a question, I think that's a great skill even beyond history. You
have incorporated this into kind of an extra education for us, if you will, because when we actually see something that we may have read about in a book, it like solidifies itself in our hearts and minds.
It does, and I think one of the best ways to solidify is not just what we've seen in a book, but to go out and experience sites, to visit places, because when you visit somewhere, you know, it brings it alive, right? It makes it real, it puts it around you, and you realize some of this stuff is actually not that long ago.
Yeah, you know, Texas is the 8th in GDP in around the world. We have a larger GDP than most countries do, and a lot of people don't realize, we know we're a great state, but don't realize how we play across the country and around the world, but very humble beginnings. Let's go back to the Texas Revolution.
Sure. The Texas Revolution is something that, of course, begins in the 1830s and carries forward for about a year or two. Kind of depends exactly how you measure it. But what's fascinating about the origins is in the later part of Texas being a part of Spain, there is a series of Anglo squatters, if you will, that are coming in. But later on, in the very last years of the Spanish Empire here, there is actually some welcoming and of colonizing of Anglos to come here. That's where the Austin family shows up. And that's to create a buffer on this northern frontier. Well, eventually what happens, of course, is the Mexican Revolution, and Mexico declares independence and creates a constitution that is very favorable for a land rush in Texas. A lot of Anglo-Americans coming in. And so that begins to kind of set the stage for later what brews just a decade later with the Texas Revolution that hits in the 1830s.
Yeah, all right. And then there's this familiar name, Sam Houston.
Sam Houston, of course, the namesake of how Houston is named after, and it was originally the capital of Texas. Now, Sam Houston, in all this chaos, comes to power. So on October 2nd in 1835, what you have is the Battle of Gonzales, and that's considered the first shots of the Texas Revolution. Now remember, that's not the only violence that takes place across Mexico at the time. There's a lot of revolutionary fervor that's taken place. The government has shifted from that constitution I mentioned, and there's different states, different areas that are having an uprising for various reasons. But there's also a suspicion of the Anglos that are in Texas. There's a suspicion that maybe eventually the United States may want to acquire Texas. With all these folks coming here, there's some disagreement on how to treat slavery and different things. So what happens eventually is that battle and the revolution. In the aftermath of that battle, there's this convention that takes place called the Consultation. And Sam Houston is elected as the Major General, the leader of the regular military, but there are some problems. For example, that convention has a very weak form of governance. Not everyone is represented, and they still allow for the military units that were volunteers, that were decentralized throughout Texas, to actually maintain their control. So Sam Houston was in charge of a regular army, but they were having a hard time organizing. and that eventually leads from the successes of 1835 to the problems in 1836.
Yeah, all right. And then Texas, as we all famously know, became its own country at one point.
That's right. So in 1836, on March 2nd, they declare independence because originally there was some disagreement on the direction of what we're trying to do here, but that makes it clear. And they put Sam Houston now commander-in-chief. So he actually has power to raise an army, which is really valuable. And now he is kind of a figurehead that's really important. And I remember they declared independence as the Alamo siege is taking place. So there's not, some things that are going on that are not in their favor at that moment. That's why they make these bold moves. Well, shortly after, once Texas succeeds in gaining independence, Sam Houston becomes the first president of Texas. Remember, not governor, president, because Texas was his own republic. Now, he does demilitarize the area, but also he tries to get Texas, with popular support, to join the United States, but the United States does not accept Texas.
Yeah, it's interesting because Texas we're not really the deep South, but we're not the Southwest either. We're kind of that Lone Star state.
Mix.
Yeah, and even you look at kind of politically where we stood in certain things. One of the things that Sam Houston did, he voted against slavery, and that was very unpopular among a lot of people at the time.
He voted against expanding slavery. Now, he was a slaveholder, but he had kind of these mixed views, not only about slavery, but on sectionalism. So, for example, he was the first president. He had to step down for the second term because he couldn't be elected consecutively, comes back for the third term, which is his second term. And in that process, he has a series of negotiations he does to enter the United States, which eventually ends up happening after about a decade of independence. Once they enter the United States, this slavery issue becomes a consideration because Texas was a state that allowed for slavery. And so what happened with Sam Houston is he was one of the first two senators to go to the United States, and he did a series of votes that they were not happy with. So, for example, the Compromise of 1850, a huge congressional deal that made some compromises on slavery. He supported it. And then there was a later bill called the Kansas-Nebraska Act in 1854, which actually reduced some prior restrictions on slavery, so it went the other direction, and he opposed that. Well, you know what that did? The Texas legislature didn't like that, and the Texas legislature condemned him. Now remember, at the time, senator was not elected by popular vote. It was elected by the state legislature. So guess what happened when he was up for Senate again? He was not voted back in. So then what happened as a result was that controversy based on his position on slavery, because he didn't want disunion. But in 1859, he came back as governor of the state, and he tried to promote union. That's how he tried to come back.
Yeah, and then of course, during the Civil War, that's when he passed away, right?
Right, so 1859 is right before the Civil War. So what happened shortly after that is in 1860, you have this secession that's going to take place with the crisis, and in 1861, Texas actually declares secession. Remember, he's a sitting governor at that point. He'd been kicked out of the Senate, but now he's a governor. And he opposes the secession, but the convention, against his wishes, votes for that secession. You know what happens? He gets kicked out as governor because of that. Literally removed from office. Not waiting for him to get reelected, but removed from office. And on July 26, in 1863, shortly after the Battle of Gettysburg, but not because of the battle, he's kind of in exile, if you will, during the Civil War. That's when he dies. His son had enrolled in the Confederate Army against his wishes. So it's really fascinating. I think to kind of tie this all together is that there's a decades-long process in Texas that's taking place, from the Spanish to the Mexican environment, the political environment, the revolution, the efforts to then annex to the United States, which are rejected. So we kind of think of, Texas as wanting to be independent for so long, but they actually were not wanting to be independent. They tried to get into the United States and they couldn't get in. But then when they did get in, now we had another issue with slavery, and Sam Houston goes from being a hero that got them into the United States to being a villain because he didn't want them to leave what he had worked so hard to do.
And now the state has the eighth largest GDP in the world. The rest of the country, how do you like us now? Right. Raffi, thank you so much.
Thank you.
And Nicole, what did you learn from that?
Texas is great.
Texas is great. There you go. Okay. For more information on Raffi and the historical presentations he can do for your group, visit greatdayhouston.com.